Before the fire went out, that's when the best stories were told. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Folklore Crypt. It helps keep these stories alive and brings more folklore to your nights. And tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. I love knowing when and where around the world these stories find you. Welcome. I'm glad you're here with me tonight. Tonight we journey into the hidden corners of African military history, into strategies that textbooks often ignore, into victories that changed the course of empires, into the minds of 7 warriors who understood something that colonial powers did not, that the greatest weapon isn't always the one you can see. This is not a story about primitive peoples fighting with spears against guns. This is a story about sophisticated psychological warfare, about leaders who understood that fear is more powerful than bullets. That belief shapes reality on the battlefield, that the mind can be both weapon and fortress. These 7 warriors used their deep knowledge of land, spirit, and human psychology to defeat armies that should have crushed them. They turned cultural practices into tactical advantages. They transformed spiritual traditions into weapons of war. They made colonial soldiers believe they were fighting forces beyond human comprehension. What if the greatest weapon against colonial expansion wasn't a gun, but psychological warfare rooted in the soil itself? What if these legendary leaders understood dimensions of combat that military academies still struggle to teach? What if their victories weren't despite their spiritual practices, but because of them? Let your breathing slow. Let these voices from the past speak. Let yourself understand that warfare is more than weapons, that strategy is more than tactics, that the human mind, properly manipulated, is the ultimate battlefield. We begin with a queen who made Portuguese soldiers believe they were fighting ghosts. In the early 1600s, Portuguese forces were expanding aggressively into what is now Angola. They had superior firearms. They had armor. They had military training refined through centuries of European warfare. They should have conquered the region within years. They didn't. For 4 decades, they were held at bay by a woman who understood that battlefield victory begins in the mind. Her name was Nzinga, Queen Nzinga. And she didn't just fight the Portuguese. She made them question reality itself. Nzinga became queen at a time when her people were already suffering under Portuguese invasion. The slave trade was devastating the region. Portuguese forces were capturing thousands of people annually. Traditional military resistance had failed. The kingdoms were fracturing. Desperation was setting in. But Nzinga had spent years observing the Portuguese, studying them, understanding not just their military capabilities but their psychological weaknesses. She recognized something crucial. European soldiers operated within a specific worldview. They believed in certain rules, certain boundaries, certain definitions of what was and wasn't possible. She would shatter those boundaries. Nzinga's first act as queen was to negotiate with the Portuguese governor. This meeting is famous in history, but not for the reasons usually taught. Yes, she refused to stand while the governor sat. Yes, she had her servant kneel so she could use them as a chair, demonstrating her refusal to be subordinate. But the real significance was what she was doing psychologically. She was establishing herself as someone who operated outside Portuguese expectations, someone who refused their frameworks, someone who wouldn't be contained by their rules of engagement. The Portuguese expected a certain kind of African leader, subservient or combative in predictable ways. Nzinga was neither. She was something else, something that didn't fit their categories. And that uncertainty, that inability to categorize her, was her first weapon. When negotiations failed and war became inevitable, Nzinga did something unprecedented. She allied with the Dutch, who were the Portuguese's enemies. But more importantly, she allied with the Mbangala warriors. These were groups the Portuguese considered savage, unpredictable, operating outside the rules of civilized warfare. Nzinga didn't just ally with them. She became one of them, adopted their practices, participated in their rituals. To the Portuguese this was shocking. A queen, someone who should be maintaining royal distance, instead choosing to become what they considered primitive. But this was strategy, because by embracing practices the Portuguese considered savage, Nzinga was doing something psychologically devastating. She was removing herself from the category of people we can negotiate with, and placing herself in the category of forces of nature we must survive. The Mbangala had a reputation for ferocity that went beyond normal warfare. They were associated with spiritual practices that Europeans found terrifying. Cannibalism, blood rituals, practices that suggested they weren't entirely human, weren't entirely of this world. By aligning herself with them, Nzinga was weaponizing that terror. She was making herself not just a military opponent but a spiritual threat. Not just a queen but a force that existed outside European understanding of how queens behaved. But Nzinga went further. She began using ritual and warfare itself. Before battles, her forces would perform ceremonies, visible to Portuguese scouts. Ceremonies involving fire, blood, dancing, sounds designed to carry across the landscape. The Portuguese soldiers, watching from distance, didn't understand what they were seeing, but they felt it. The ceremonies weren't just spiritual, they were psychological warfare, creating atmosphere of dread, making soldiers question what they were about to face. Were these human warriors? Or something else? Something that operated by different rules? Something that couldn't be killed by normal means? This uncertainty is a weapon. Soldiers fight differently when they're uncertain. They hesitate. They make mistakes. They're more likely to retreat. More likely to break formation. More likely to panic when something unexpected happens. And Nzinga made sure unexpected things happened constantly. Her forces used guerrilla tactics that seemed to violate natural law. They would appear and disappear. Attack from impossible angles. Survive what should have been fatal encounters. Not because of magic, though the Portuguese began to suspect magic, but because Nzinga understood terrain in ways the Portuguese didn't. She knew every valley, every forest, every river. She knew where to hide, where to stage ambushes, where to retreat to. She turned the land itself into an ally, made it seem like the very earth was fighting for her. Portuguese soldiers began reporting strange phenomena, seeing warriors where none should be, hearing sounds that made no sense, feeling presences in the forest. These weren't supernatural events. They were psychological effects of fighting an enemy who controlled the environment completely, who used knowledge of terrain to create illusions of omnipresence. But the genius was that Nzinga never corrected these beliefs. Never said, "No, it's just tactics." She let the Portuguese believe they were fighting something supernatural. Let them tell each other stories about warriors who couldn't be killed, about a queen who could curse them, about spirits in the forest who served her. These stories spread through Portuguese camps, back to Portugal itself. And every story made the next group of soldiers more afraid, more hesitant, more likely to see threats where none existed. This is psychological warfare at its finest, using the enemy's own imagination against them, making them create their own terror. Nzinga also understood the importance of personal mythology. She cultivated stories about herself that spread through both African and Portuguese communities. Stories about her killing her own brother to take the throne. About her having male servants she treated as wives. About her executing anyone who displeased her. Were all these stories true? Probably not. But accuracy wasn't the point. The point was creating an image of someone operating by rules so different from European norms that predicting her behavior became impossible. Portuguese commanders never knew what Nzinga would do next. Would she negotiate? Would she attack? Would she retreat? Would she do something unprecedented that violated every rule of warfare they understood? This unpredictability is a massive tactical advantage. Commanders make plans based on predicting enemy behavior. When the enemy is truly unpredictable, those plans become worthless. Every decision becomes a gamble. Every move becomes uncertain. And uncertainty breeds fear. Fear breeds mistakes. Mistakes lead to defeat. Nzinga maintained this psychological pressure for decades. Through negotiations, through battles, through periods of relative peace. She never let the Portuguese settle. Never let them feel secure. Never let them believe they understood her or her forces. She also understood something crucial about colonial mindset. European powers believed in progress. Believed that their weapons, their tactics, their civilization were inherently superior. This belief made them vulnerable to certain psychological attacks. When Nzinga's forces defeated Portuguese troops using what appeared to be inferior weapons, it created cognitive dissonance. It didn't make sense according to the European worldview. Superior technology should win. Superior training should prevail. When it didn't, when Portuguese forces retreated or were defeated, it created psychological crisis. How could the inferior defeat the superior? The only explanation that made sense to many Portuguese soldiers was that something else was at play. Something beyond normal warfare. Something supernatural. Something that made normal rules irrelevant. And once soldiers believe they're fighting supernatural forces, their effectiveness drops dramatically. They stop trusting their weapons. Stop trusting their training. Stop believing victory is possible through normal means. Nzinga also understood the power of symbolism in warfare. She wore certain colors in battle. Certain patterns. She positioned herself visibly so Portuguese forces could see her, could identify her. This seems counterintuitive. A commander making themselves a target. But Nzinga understood that her presence had psychological effect. Portuguese soldiers knew who she was, knew her reputation. Seeing her on the battlefield reminded them of all the stories, all the defeats, all the strangeness. And when she survived battles where she should have died, because her guards were excellent, because she was skilled at warfare, because she understood tactical positioning, it reinforced the belief that she was protected by forces beyond the physical. Nzinga's greatest victory wasn't any single battle. It was the cumulative psychological effect of 4 decades of warfare that left the Portuguese exhausted, demoralized, and unable to fully conquer her territories despite massive advantages in weaponry and resources. She died at 81, still ruling, still undefeated. The Portuguese eventually established more control in Angola, but only after her death. Her lifetime of psychological warfare had held an empire at bay for 2 generations. The lesson Nzinga teaches is that warfare is ultimately about will. About who can maintain their determination longest. About who can make the enemy lose faith in victory. About creating conditions where the enemy chooses to retreat not because they were defeated in battle but because continuing seems impossible or futile. She understood that the human mind is the ultimate battlefield. That perception shapes reality in war. That making enemies believe they're fighting something beyond their understanding is more effective than any weapon. Modern military theorists call this 4th-generation warfare. Psychological operations. Information warfare. Using belief and perception as weapons. Nzinga was practicing this centuries before it had a name. Using her culture's spiritual practices not as superstition but as sophisticated psychological tools. She turned ritual into terror. Turned mythology into tactical advantage. turned the Portuguese soldiers' own fears and uncertainties into weapons pointed at themselves. This is the first warrior. The first example of how African leaders used psychological warfare rooted in spiritual practice to defeat colonial forces. But there are 6 more. Each with their own genius. Each with their own methods. Each proving that indigenous knowledge, properly applied, could be more powerful than any colonial weapon. While Nzinga fought the Portuguese in Central Africa, another resistance leader was perfecting psychological warfare against the French in West Africa. His name was Samori Touré, and he transformed an entire empire into a weapon against colonial expansion. Samori's genius was different from Nzinga's. Where she used ritual and reputation, Samori used mobility and mystique. He created an army that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, that could fight pitched battles when advantageous and vanish like smoke when not, that left French commanders perpetually uncertain, perpetually off balance, perpetually exhausted. Samori rose from humble origins. Born into a trading family, he built himself into an emperor through military brilliance and political acumen. By the 1880s, he controlled a vast territory in what is now Guinea, Mali, and Côte d'Ivoire. The French, expanding their colonial holdings, saw his empire as an obstacle to be removed. They expected removal would take months. It took nearly 2 decades. And it nearly broke the French colonial project in West Africa. Samori understood something fundamental about colonial warfare. European armies relied on supply lines, on bases, on predictable patterns of movement. They fought wars of position, of holding territory, of establishing control over fixed points. He would give them none of that. Samori's empire became mobile. When French forces advanced, entire cities would evacuate. Populations would move with the army. Infrastructure would be dismantled and carried. Nothing permanent was left for the French to capture or control. This created profound psychological effect on French troops. They would march for weeks, expecting to capture a city or engage an army. Instead, they'd find emptiness, abandoned settlements, no supplies to capture, no population to control, no enemy to fight. The French soldiers began to feel like they were chasing ghosts, like they were fighting an enemy that existed in a different dimension. They could see evidence of Samori's empire, settlements recently abandoned, fields recently harvested, but could never quite grasp it. This uncertainty is psychologically devastating. Soldiers need concrete objectives, need to feel they're making progress. When every advance meets emptiness, when every victory is hollow, morale collapses. But Samori went further. He didn't just retreat, he harassed. His forces would strike French supply lines, attack stragglers, ambush patrols, then disappear before reinforcements arrived. French troops began experiencing what modern psychologists call hypervigilance, constant state of alert, never knowing when attack might come, seeing threats in every shadow. This state is exhausting. It breaks down soldiers physically and mentally, and Samori made sure his attacks seemed to come from impossible directions. From terrain the French had scouted and deemed empty, from positions that shouldn't have been reachable in the time since the last engagement, from angles that violated French tactical assumptions. This wasn't magic. This was superior knowledge of terrain. Faster movement than European armies thought possible. Better intelligence networks. More mobility. More willingness to endure hardship that French troops wouldn't accept. But to French soldiers, it seemed supernatural. Seemed like Samori's forces could move through space in ways that violated natural law. Could appear and disappear at will. Could be in multiple places simultaneously. Samori cultivated this mystique deliberately. He used traditional West African spiritual practices, not as religion alone but as psychological warfare. Before battles, his warriors would perform ceremonies, would wear amulets, would carry items believed to provide spiritual protection. French soldiers, observing this, began to believe Samori's forces were protected by powers they didn't understand. When those forces survived encounters that should have been fatal, because they were skilled warriors with excellent tactics, not because of magic, it reinforced supernatural beliefs. Samori also understood the power of seeming invincibility. He positioned himself carefully in battles, made himself visible when tactically sound. When he survived because of bodyguards, armor, tactical positioning, it added to his legend. Stories spread through French ranks about Samori being bulletproof, about him having supernatural knowledge of French plans, about his ability to curse enemies, about spirits fighting for him. Again, these weren't necessarily true, but Samori never corrected them. Let the French believe what they wanted, used their superstitions against them. He also employed what modern military calls information warfare. He planted false information that French scouts would discover, created decoy camps, sent messengers who would accidentally be captured carrying misleading plans, made French commanders constantly second-guess their intelligence. This created paralysis. French commanders never knew if their information was accurate, never knew if that army they were marching toward actually existed or was a diversion, never knew if the safe route was actually safe or a trap. Every decision became fraught with uncertainty, and uncertainty slows decision-making, makes commanders hesitant, creates opportunities for the more decisive force to exploit. Samori was always more decisive, because he wasn't trying to hold territory, wasn't trying to establish permanent control, was simply trying to make French occupation so costly, so frustrating, so psychologically exhausting that they would eventually give up. He nearly succeeded. For 17 years he held the French at bay, forced them to commit massive resources, made their West African campaign far more expensive than anticipated, caused numerous commanders to resign or be recalled in failure. Samori also understood the importance of propaganda. He sent emissaries to other African kingdoms, to Muslim communities across West Africa, spreading his story, making himself a symbol of resistance, creating psychological impact beyond his actual territory. When other kingdoms heard about Samori's victories, they were emboldened. When French commanders heard about his victories, they were demoralized. This is psychological warfare operating at strategic level, affecting entire regions, influencing decisions by people who never directly encountered Samori's forces. One of Samori's most brilliant psychological tactics was his use of captured French weapons. When his forces captured rifles, artillery, ammunition, they didn't just use them. They displayed them, made sure French scouts saw them, made sure French prisoners saw them. This created specific psychological effect. The fear that your own weapons will be used against you, that every defeat potentially strengthens your enemy, that the technological advantage you rely on isn't actually an advantage because your enemy can acquire and use the same technology. Samori went further. He had blacksmiths who could reproduce French rifles. The quality wasn't always equal, but it didn't need to be perfect. It needed to be good enough to work and visible enough to see. When French troops saw African forces carrying what looked like European rifles, it shattered assumptions about technological superiority. If the enemy could make or acquire your weapons, what advantage did you actually have? This cognitive dissonance is psychologically destabilizing. European colonial expansion was justified through narratives of technological and cultural superiority. When that superiority was demonstrably false, When African forces proved capable of using, reproducing, and effectively deploying European technology, the entire narrative collapsed. And when the narrative that justifies your presence in a place collapses, continuing becomes much harder. Soldiers begin asking why they're there, what they're fighting for, whether victory is even meaningful. Samori also employed brilliant strategic deception. He would negotiate with the French when pressed, make peace treaties, then use the peace periods to rearm, reorganize, relocate. When he was ready, he'd resume resistance. The French saw this as treachery, as violation of agreements, but Samori saw it as tactics, as using negotiation as a weapon like any other, as creating breathing room when needed. This pragmatism frustrated French commanders who expected a certain kind of honor in warfare, who expected agreements to be permanent, who operated within European concepts of diplomatic integrity. Samori operated by different rules, rules shaped by necessity, by understanding that resistance required using every tool available, that survival justified flexible morality, that protecting his people mattered more than European concepts of honorable conduct. This moral flexibility is its own psychological weapon. Enemies who expect you to follow certain rules become predictable. When you don't follow those rules, when you use methods they consider dishonorable, they become confused, angry, distracted by sense of injustice rather than focused on tactics. Samori's resistance finally ended in 1898 when he was captured. But his 17-year campaign had cost the French enormously. In resources, in lives, in time, in psychological toll on soldiers and commanders, in damaged reputation across Africa and Europe. His legacy lived on, inspired other resistance movements, became symbol of what was possible. Proof that European powers could be fought, that colonial conquest wasn't inevitable, that indigenous tactics, properly applied, could match or exceed colonial military capability. The lesson Samori teaches is about mobility and mystique, about making yourself impossible to pin down, about turning the enemy's expectations into weapons against them, about using terrain not just as battlefield but as ally, about creating psychological atmosphere where the enemy is perpetually uncertain, perpetually exhausted, perpetually questioning the possibility of victory. While Samori fought the French, another leader was demonstrating the power of spiritual authority in warfare. Yasantawa, Queen Mother of the Ashanti Empire in modern-day Ghana, proved that psychological warfare doesn't require personal participation in combat. It requires understanding how to mobilize belief itself as a weapon. The Ashanti Empire had been resisting British colonialism for decades. By 1900, the British had captured the Ashanti king and exiled him to the Seychelles. They believed resistance would collapse without male leadership. They believed that with the king gone, the empire would submit. They were catastrophically wrong. Yasantawa stood before the remaining Ashanti chiefs and delivered a speech that changed everything. She challenged the men, asked if they would allow the British to take the golden stool, the sacred seat of Ashanti power, the physical embodiment of Ashanti sovereignty, the spiritual heart of the empire. Her words were calculated psychological intervention. She wasn't just giving a speech. She was manipulating shame, honor, and spiritual belief to mobilize an entire empire for war. She said essentially, "If you men will not fight, then I will. I will lead the women. We will defend what you are too afraid to defend." This was brilliant psychological warfare operating at multiple levels. First, it challenged masculine honor. In Ashanti culture, as in most cultures, men were expected to be warriors, to be protectors, to defend the community. By suggesting women would do what men wouldn't, Yasantawa activated deep cultural shame. No Ashanti chief could accept being shown up by women. Cultural expectations made retreat impossible. They had to fight, not just for the golden stool, for their own honor, for their identity as men, for their place in society. Second, Santawa framed the conflict in spiritual terms. The golden stool wasn't just a chair. It was the soul of the Ashanti people. It contained the spirits of ancestors. It was the source of royal authority. It was the connection between living and dead, between present and past, between earth and spiritual realm. By making the war about defending the golden stool, Santawa made it a spiritual imperative. Not a political conflict but a sacred duty. This changed everything about how warriors approached battle. When you're fighting for political reasons, you can negotiate, can surrender, can accept defeat. When you're fighting for spiritual reasons, those options disappear. The fight becomes absolute, becomes about more than survival, becomes about cosmic balance, about relationship with ancestors, about preserving spiritual integrity. British commanders didn't understand this shift. They expected rational calculation. Expected that when Ashanti forces faced superior firepower, they would retreat or surrender. Expected colonial conflicts to follow predictable patterns. Instead, they faced warriors who fought with intensity that seemed irrational, who took casualties that should have broken morale but didn't, who kept fighting when tactical calculation said to retreat, who seemed unafraid of death in ways that violated British assumptions about human behavior. This wasn't irrational. It was different rationality. When you believe you're fighting for spiritual survival, when you believe your ancestors are watching, when you believe defeat means not just political subjugation but spiritual death, you fight differently. Santawa understood this. Used it. Mobilized spiritual belief as tactical weapon. She also understood the power of symbol and ritual in warfare. Before battles, Ashanti warriors performed ceremonies, called on ancestors, received blessings from priests. These weren't just religious observances. They were psychological preparation, creating mental state where warriors believed they were protected, believed they were fighting with supernatural support, believed victory was spiritually ordained. This belief is powerful. It reduces fear, increases courage, makes warriors more effective in combat, not because of actual supernatural intervention, but because of psychological effect of belief itself. British soldiers observed these ceremonies and reacted with mixture of confusion and unease. They didn't understand what they were seeing, didn't know how to interpret it. This uncertainty created psychological vulnerability. When you don't understand your enemy's motivations, when their behavior doesn't make sense within your framework, you become hesitant. Second-guess your tactics. Wonder if you're missing something crucial. Santawa also employed what might be called moral warfare. She positioned the conflict as righteous defense against unjust invasion. The British were violating sacred spaces, taking what wasn't theirs, disrespecting spiritual traditions. This moral clarity gave Ashanti warriors psychological advantage. When you know you're right, when you believe your cause is just, you fight with clear conscience. When you believe you're defending something sacred against profane violation, you fight with righteous anger. British soldiers, meanwhile, were fighting for empire, for abstract concepts like civilization and progress, for economic interests. These motivations are less psychologically powerful than defending your homeland and spirits. This disparity in moral conviction creates asymmetry. The side that believes more strongly often performs better even with tactical disadvantages. Conviction compensates for material weakness. The war Santawa led lasted months. The British eventually won through overwhelming force and starvation tactics. They besieged Ashanti positions, cut off supply lines, made continued resistance materially impossible. But the psychological victory was Santawa's. The British never broke Ashanti will. Never made them submit psychologically. Captured Santawa and exiled her, but couldn't erase the example she set. Couldn't prevent her story from spreading. Couldn't undo the psychological impact of her leadership. Her legacy inspired resistance movements across West Africa. Proved that spiritual leadership could mobilize entire populations for war. Showed that women could be effective military leaders. Demonstrated that colonial powers could be fought to standstill by forces operating with different motivations and different sources of strength. The lesson Santawa teaches is about belief as weapon. About understanding that human motivation is more than rational calculation. About recognizing that spiritual conviction can overcome material disadvantage. About using cultural symbols and practices to create psychological states that enhance military effectiveness. She also teaches about leadership itself. About the power of example. About speaking truth that mobilizes action. About understanding your audience so well that you can manipulate their deepest values to achieve necessary goals. Modern psychological operations incorporate these principles. Understanding cultural values. Using spiritual or moral frameworks to motivate action. Creating symbolic stakes that make conflict feel absolute. Manipulating shame, honor, pride to mobilize populations. Santawa was doing this before it had formal doctrine. Using indigenous understanding of human psychology to create military force that punched far above its weight. Turning cultural practices into tactical advantages. Making spirituality itself into weapon of war. These three warriors, Nzinga, Samori, Santawa, represent different approaches to psychological warfare. Personal mythology and ritual theater. Mobility and mystique. Spiritual mobilization and moral authority. Each adapted to their specific context. Each brilliantly effective. Each proving that indigenous knowledge, properly weaponized, could match or exceed colonial military power. But there are 4 more warriors to discuss. 4 more approaches. 4 more proofs that psychological warfare rooted in indigenous practices was sophisticated military strategy, not primitive superstition. In January 1879, British forces invaded Zululand with confidence bordering on arrogance. They had modern rifles, artillery, and disciplined troops. They expected quick victory against what they considered a primitive enemy armed with spears. At the Battle of Isandawana, 20,000 Zulu warriors destroyed a British force of 1,800 men. It was one of the most devastating defeats in British military history. The victory wasn't just about numbers. It was about psychological warfare so effective that British soldiers later reported feeling paralyzed by fear even before combat began. King Setshwayo Kampan had inherited a military tradition perfected by his predecessor Shaka Zulu. But Setshwayo understood something crucial. The Zulu military system wasn't just about tactics. It was about creating psychological states in both his own warriors and the enemy. It was about turning the battlefield into theater where fear itself became a weapon. The Zulu military formation was called the Horns of the Buffalo. The main force, the chest, would engage the enemy frontally. Meanwhile, 2 flanks, the horns, would encircle from either side. A reserve force, the loins, waited behind to exploit any breakthrough. On paper, this was standard envelopment tactics. But the psychological execution made it devastating. The British scouts reported seeing Zulu forces approaching. But what they saw wasn't just an army. It was a synchronized organism. Thousands of warriors moving in perfect coordination. Chanting. Stamping. Creating rhythmic sound that carried across the landscape. The ground itself seemed to shake. This wasn't accidental. The Zulu had perfected the use of sound as psychological weapon. The war chants weren't just for motivation. They were designed to be heard by the enemy, designed to trigger primal fear responses. The rhythmic stamping created vibration that soldiers could feel in their bones. British troops, hearing this approaching, felt fear before they saw danger. Sound triggers fight or flight responses faster than visual information. By the time Zulu warriors were visible, British soldiers were already experiencing elevated heart rates, adrenaline surges, psychological preparation for terror. But the Zulu added visual psychological warfare. Warriors wore specific regiments' colors and decorations, carried distinctive shields, created visual patterns that were both beautiful and terrifying. When 20,000 warriors moved in synchronized formation, the visual effect was overwhelming. Human brains process large moving groups as single entity. When that entity is advancing in perfect coordination, wearing coordinated colors, creating coordinated sound, it triggers specific fear response. You're not facing individuals but a single massive predator. This triggers deeper, more primal fear than facing individual enemies. The British tried to maintain formation, tried to fire disciplined volleys. But the psychological effect of the Zulu advance was breaking their cohesion. Soldiers were making mistakes, firing too early, wasting ammunition, breaking ranks to reload when they should have maintained position. Then the Zulu employed perhaps their most psychologically devastating tactic. As they closed distance, they began running. Not disorganized charge but synchronized sprint. Thousands of warriors accelerating in unison. The sound of 20,000 men running creates specific acoustic effect. Sounds like thunder, like avalanche, like natural disaster. It triggers psychological association with unstoppable force, with inevitable destruction. British soldiers, watching this wall of warriors accelerating toward them, experienced what modern psychologists call acute stress response. Time perception distorted. Fine motor control deteriorated. Rational decision-making became nearly impossible. Many soldiers simply froze. This freezing response is psychological gold for attackers. Frozen enemies don't shoot, don't retreat, don't adapt. They just wait to be overwhelmed. But Setshweo's psychological warfare went deeper than battle tactics. Before the battle, Zulu warriors performed extensive spiritual preparation. They consulted with sangomas, traditional healers, received protective medicines, participated in ceremonies designed to invoke ancestral protection. British scouts observed these ceremonies, reported them back. British officers dismissed them as primitive superstition. But the ceremonies had two effects that mattered militarily. First, they created psychological state in Zulu warriors where they believed they were protected. This reduced fear, increased courage, made warriors more willing to take risks, more committed to pressing attacks, more resilient when facing casualties. Second, the ceremonies created uncertainty in British troops. Soldiers who heard about pre-battle rituals began wondering if there was something to them. When Zulu warriors showed seemingly reckless courage, charging into rifle fire, continuing to advance despite casualties, British soldiers began to question whether the spiritual protection might be real. This doubt is psychologically corrosive. When you start questioning your assumptions about reality, your effectiveness in combat decreases. You second-guess. You hesitate. You make mistakes. Setshweo also understood psychological importance of previous victories. Before Isandlwana, Zulu forces had defeated smaller British units. Stories of these victories spread, created reputation, made British soldiers approach battles with reduced confidence. When soldiers expect to lose, they often do. Expectation shapes behavior. Soldiers who doubt victory fight more cautiously, are more likely to retreat, more likely to panic when things go wrong. Setshweo weaponized this expectation. The Zulu also used what might be called honor warfare as psychological tactic. Zulu military culture emphasized courage above all. Warriors were expected to close with enemy, to fight hand to hand, to show no fear. This cultural value created specific military advantage. British soldiers were trained for disciplined distance warfare. Stand in formation. Fire volleys. Maintain order. But when facing enemy that prioritizes closing distance for hand-to-hand combat, that discipline becomes liability. Because once the enemy reaches your lines, formation breaks. Rifles become useless. Training becomes irrelevant. And British soldiers knew this. Knew that if Zulu warriors reached them, the battle would become close-quarters melee where British advantages disappeared. This knowledge created pressure. Made every moment before contact feel like impending doom. Made the Zulu advance psychologically unbearable. At Isandlwana, this psychological warfare achieved perfect execution. British lines broke. Soldiers fled. The organized retreat became rout. Panic spread faster than Zulu warriors could advance. Men died not from Zulu spears but from trampling each other. From running blindly into dangerous terrain. From making desperate decisions born of terror. The British officers tried to rally their troops. Tried to restore order. But psychological collapse had reached critical mass. Once enough soldiers break, panic becomes contagious. Spreads through units like disease. No amount of officer leadership can stop it. This is what superior psychological warfare achieves. Not just defeating enemies' bodies but breaking enemies' mind. Making them defeat themselves through panic, through poor decisions, through collapse of cohesion and discipline. Cetshwayo's victory at Isandlwana sent shockwaves through British Empire. Demonstrated that colonial military superiority wasn't guaranteed. That indigenous forces, using indigenous tactics enhanced by psychological warfare, could destroy modern armies. The British responded with massive escalation. Brought in reinforcements. Changed tactics. Eventually overwhelmed the Zulu kingdom through sheer numerical and material superiority. But they never forgot Isandlwana. Never stopped studying what went wrong. Never stopped trying to understand how psychological factors could overcome technological advantage. The lesson Cetshwayo teaches is about the power of coordinated psychological assault. About using sound, sight, movement and spiritual preparation to create multi-layered fear response. About understanding that the human mind has specific vulnerabilities that can be exploited through careful tactical design. About recognizing that making the enemy defeat themselves is more efficient than defeating them directly. Modern military forces study the Battle of Isandlwana precisely because of its psychological dimensions. How do you maintain cohesion under extreme psychological pressure? How do you prevent panic from spreading? How do you train soldiers to function when facing overwhelming sensory assault designed to trigger primal fear? These questions remain relevant because the psychological vulnerabilities Cetshwayo exploited are still present in human nature. Technology changes. Weapons improve. But the human mind's susceptibility to fear, to uncertainty, to psychological manipulation remains constant. While Cetshwayo was demonstrating the power of coordinated psychological assault, another African leader was perfecting a different form of psychological warfare. The strategic deployment of female warriors to shatter enemy psychological expectations. King Bihanzin of Dahomey, modern-day Benin, commanded the most famous all-female military unit in African history, the Dahomey Amazons, known locally as the Mino, our mothers. Between 1890 to 1894, these warriors fought French colonial forces using tactics specifically designed to exploit psychological vulnerabilities created by encountering female combatants. The French arrived expecting to fight African men. This expectation shaped their psychological preparation, their tactical planning, their entire mental framework for the conflict. The presence of female warriors shattered that framework. Created cognitive dissonance so severe it affected French combat effectiveness. European military culture in the 1890s was deeply gendered. Men were warriors. Women were non-combatants. This wasn't just social convention, it was psychological bedrock. Soldiers were trained to protect women, not fight them. The idea of women as lethal combatants violated every cultural assumption French troops carried. When French soldiers first encountered Dahomey female warriors in battle, The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. These weren't women cowering behind men. These weren't women serving support roles. These were women charging into combat, wielding weapons, killing effectively. The French soldiers' brains couldn't process this easily. Cultural programming said women aren't threats. Direct experience said, these women are very much threats. This contradiction creates psychological stress called cognitive dissonance. The mind struggles to reconcile contradictory information. This struggle impairs decision-making. French soldiers hesitated. Not from cowardice but from cultural confusion. Should they shoot? Should they fight women the same way they'd fight men? Their training said yes. Their cultural conditioning said no. This moment of hesitation, even fractions of a second, was lethal in combat. Behanzin understood this. The deployment of female warriors wasn't just military necessity. It was psychological warfare. Using the enemy's own cultural values against them. Making their civilization a liability rather than an asset. But the psychological warfare went deeper. The Dahomey female warriors were exceptionally well trained. Better trained than many French colonial troops. They could shoot accurately. Fight hand-to-hand effectively. Move through terrain efficiently. They weren't women pretending to be soldiers. They were elite warriors who happened to be women. This competence amplified the psychological impact. It's one thing to face women in combat and overcome cultural hesitation. It's another to face women in combat and lose. When French soldiers were killed or wounded by female warriors, it created specific psychological trauma. In Victorian military culture, being defeated by women was ultimate humiliation. It violated masculine identity, created shame that went beyond normal combat loss. French soldiers who survived encounters with Dahomey female warriors carried psychological wounds different from ordinary combat trauma. This shame had military consequences. Soldiers didn't want to admit they'd been defeated by women. Officers didn't want to report it. This created intelligence gaps. French commanders didn't get accurate information about female warriors' effectiveness because reporting it felt humiliating. These intelligence gaps led to poor tactical decisions. French forces would underestimate female units, would allocate insufficient resources to counter them, would make strategic errors based on assumption that female warriors couldn't be as dangerous as male warriors. Then they'd encounter reality and lose. And the cycle would repeat because the humiliation of losing made accurate reporting psychologically difficult. Behanzin also used the female warriors for specific psychological operations. They would be sent on raids designed to maximize psychological impact. Attacking at night, striking from unexpected directions, creating terror through unpredictability. French soldiers learned to fear darkness differently, because darkness might contain female warriors, might contain enemies who violated every assumption about warfare, might contain death from sources your culture told you were impossible. This fear created hypervigilance. Soldiers constantly on alert, never fully relaxing. Sleep disrupted by fear of night raids. This constant stress degrades combat effectiveness over time, creates exhaustion that goes beyond physical fatigue. The Dahomey female warriors also performed specific rituals before combat. These rituals served multiple purposes. For the warriors themselves, they created psychological preparation, invoked spiritual protection, created mental state of fearlessness. For the French observers, these rituals created additional psychological uncertainty. What were these women doing? Were these just ceremonies or something more? Did these rituals actually provide some kind of protection or advantage? This uncertainty compounded the existing psychological stress. French soldiers already confused by fighting women. Now those women were performing rituals French soldiers didn't understand, creating layered psychological pressure. Behanzin also understood the propaganda value of female warriors. Their existence challenged European narratives about African primitiveness. Europeans believed African societies were backwards, that they didn't allow women meaningful roles, that they were patriarchal in unsophisticated ways. The presence of elite female warriors shattered these narratives, forced French to acknowledge that this primitive society had gender dynamics more progressive than their own in some ways, that African military sophistication exceeded European assumptions. This cognitive dissonance operated at strategic level. French colonial justification rested partly on bringing civilization to backwards peoples. When those peoples demonstrated military and social organization that exceeded European civilization in specific ways, the justification weakened. Behanzin also deployed female warriors in intelligence gathering. They could move through areas where male warriors would be noticed, could interact with populations in ways that created less suspicion, could gather information that male intelligence operatives couldn't access. This intelligence advantage created tactical edge. Behanzin often knew French movements before French knew his, could plan ambushes based on accurate information, could avoid traps because his intelligence network warned him. The female warriors were crucial to this network. Their ability to gather intelligence without raising suspicion created information asymmetry that Behanzin exploited brilliantly. The French eventually overwhelmed Dahomey through massive military superiority, brought in thousands of troops, used artillery extensively, employed scorched earth tactics. But even in defeat, Behanzin's female warriors inflicted disproportionate casualties, fought until capture or death, never surrendered psychologically even when military defeat was inevitable. French soldiers who fought them never forgot the experience. Many carried psychological scars. The trauma of fighting and being defeated by women created lasting psychological impact that ordinary combat wouldn't have produced. Years later, French veterans would still talk about the Dahomey Amazons with mixture of respect and discomfort. Respect for their fighting ability, discomfort with what their existence meant for French cultural assumptions. This discomfort was itself proof of effective psychological warfare. The lesson Behanzin teaches is about exploiting cultural assumptions, about recognizing that enemy psychology is shaped by their culture, that cultural values create vulnerabilities, that using forces enemy culture tells them are impossible creates psychological advantage that exceeds pure military capability. He also teaches about the importance of disrupting enemy intelligence, about creating situations where enemy can't or won't report accurately, about using shame and humiliation as weapons that persist beyond immediate combat. Modern militaries study the Dahomey Amazons as example of how challenging gender assumptions affects combat psychology. How do soldiers fight effectively when cultural programming conflicts with combat necessity? How do commanders plan when intelligence is distorted by cultural shame? How do military institutions adapt when reality violates cultural assumptions? These questions remain relevant, because military effectiveness ultimately depends on accurate perception of reality. And when psychological warfare makes accurate perception psychologically difficult, military effectiveness degrades regardless of technological advantage. Both Setsueo and Behanzin demonstrated that indigenous military forces could compete with colonial powers by weaponizing psychology, by understanding enemy psychology better than enemy understood itself, by creating combat conditions that triggered psychological vulnerabilities enemies didn't know they had. But there are two more warriors to discuss, two more approaches to psychological warfare, two more proofs that indigenous knowledge, properly applied, created military advantages that technology alone couldn't overcome. In 1896, Ethiopian forces under Emperor Menelik II achieved what seemed impossible: a decisive military victory over a European colonial power. At the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopian forces destroyed an Italian army, killing or capturing nearly 70% of Italian troops. It was the first time an African nation had defeated a European army using modern weapons in a conventional battle. But the victory wasn't just about weapons or numbers. It was about psychological warfare operating at multiple levels: strategic deception, intelligence superiority, and the devastating psychological impact of shattering European assumptions about inevitable colonial triumph. Menelik II understood something fundamental: information is power. While other African leaders focused on military tactics, Menelik built perhaps the most sophisticated intelligence network in African history. He knew what the Italians were planning before Italian field commanders knew. He understood Italian political divisions better than many Italian politicians. He weaponized information asymmetry. The Italians believed they were dealing with a primitive kingdom. They assumed Ethiopian leaders couldn't read Italian documents, couldn't understand European diplomacy, couldn't operate intelligence networks comparable to European powers. They were catastrophically wrong. Menelik had informants throughout Italian colonial administration. Ethiopian priests, traders, servants, and diplomats who could read Italian, who understood European politics, who reported directly to Menelik. He knew Italian troop movements, supply situations, and internal disagreements. This intelligence advantage created psychological effect before battle began. Menelik positioned forces based on perfect knowledge of Italian movements. Italian commanders would plan advances only to discover Ethiopian forces already in optimal defensive positions. Would attempt flanking maneuvers only to find Ethiopians had anticipated and countered. This happened repeatedly during the campaign leading to Adwa. Italian commanders began feeling like they were fighting an enemy who could read their minds, who knew their plans before they executed them, who anticipated every move. This psychological pressure creates paranoia. Commanders start questioning their own intelligence, start suspecting traitors, start second-guessing decisions, start making mistakes born of uncertainty. But Menelik went further. He planted false information that Italian spies would discover, created decoy camps, sent fake messages meant to be intercepted, made Italian commanders think Ethiopian forces were weaker, more divided, less prepared than they actually were. When Italian forces reached Adwa expecting to face fragmented resistance, they instead encountered unified Ethiopian army of 100,000 well-armed troops. The psychological shock was devastating. Everything their intelligence had told them was wrong. They had marched into trap. This intelligence failure created immediate psychological crisis among Italian commanders. If their information was this wrong about troop strength, what else were they wrong about? Could they trust any of their intelligence? This uncertainty paralyzed decision-making. Menelik also understood the psychological power of European weapons in African hands. He had been stockpiling modern rifles for years, buying them from multiple European suppliers. By Adwa, Ethiopian forces had nearly as many modern rifles as Italian forces. Some Ethiopian units were better armed than Italian units. When Italian troops engaged Ethiopian forces, they expected technological superiority, expected that their rifles would give them decisive advantage. Instead, they faced enemies with equivalent weapons who knew the terrain better and were more motivated. This created profound psychological crisis. European colonial expansion rested on assumption of technological superiority. When that superiority was demonstrably absent, when African forces proved capable of acquiring and effectively using European weapons, the entire psychological foundation of colonialism cracked. Italian soldiers began asking questions they shouldn't have been asking. If we don't have technological advantage, why are we here? If they can fight as well as we can, what justifies this invasion? If they can match our weapons, what's preventing them from winning? These doubts degraded combat effectiveness. Soldiers who question their mission fight differently than soldiers who believe in their cause. Less aggressively, less committedly, more ready to retreat when things go badly. Menelik also employed brilliant strategic psychology. He presented himself to Italians as sophisticated diplomat, spoke multiple languages, understood European politics, could negotiate treaties using European legal language. This sophistication was itself psychological warfare. Italians expected primitive African king. Instead encountered ruler who could operate fluently in European diplomatic sphere. This cognitive dissonance made them underestimate him militarily because they couldn't reconcile diplomatic sophistication with military capability. Menelik used this underestimation tactically. Would negotiate while simultaneously preparing for war. Would make concessions that seemed significant but were strategically meaningless. Would create appearance of weakness while building strength. When war came, Italians were psychologically unprepared. They'd negotiated with diplomatic Menelik. Now they faced military Menelik. These seemed like different people. Created confusion about who they were actually fighting. This confusion is tactical advantage. Enemies who can't form coherent picture of their opponent make poor decisions. Can't anticipate. Can't plan effectively. Can't adapt appropriately. Menelik also weaponized Ethiopian unity itself. The Italian strategy assumed Ethiopian empire was fragmented. That different regions, different ethnic groups, different nobles would be easily divided. That Ethiopian resistance would be isolated and uncoordinated. Instead, Menelik created unprecedented unity. Mobilized forces from across empire. United different groups under single command structure. Presented Italians with coordinated resistance rather than fragmented opposition. The psychological impact of this unity was enormous. Italian commanders had planned for divide and conquer. When that strategy proved impossible, when they faced unified Ethiopian nation rather than fragmentable territories, their entire strategic framework collapsed. They had to abandon plans based on months of preparation, had to improvise new strategies, had to fight the war they feared rather than the war they planned for. This improvisation under pressure led to mistakes, led to poor decisions, led to tactical errors that cost them the battle. At Adwa itself, Menelik employed brilliant tactical psychology. Ethiopian forces attacked at dawn, caught Italians still establishing positions. The timing was perfect, exploiting moment of maximum Italian vulnerability. But Menelik also used terrain psychologically, positioned forces on high ground, made Italians attack uphill. This created both tactical and psychological advantage. Soldiers attacking uphill are not just physically stressed. They're psychologically disadvantaged. They're looking up at enemy. They're exposed. They feel vulnerable. Ethiopian forces, fighting downhill from defensive positions, had opposite psychological experience. They felt protected, felt superior, felt the land itself was helping them. This psychological difference affected combat effectiveness on both sides. Menelik also deployed forces in ways that created impression of overwhelming numbers. Units would engage, withdraw, be replaced by fresh units. Italians never got accurate count of Ethiopian forces. Always felt like they were facing more enemies than actually present. This uncertainty about enemy strength creates psychological pressure. You might be winning your immediate engagement, but you don't know if you're winning the overall battle. don't know if there are more enemy forces waiting. This uncertainty makes retreat seem more reasonable than persistence. When Italian lines began breaking, panic spread rapidly. Units fled, abandoned wounded comrades, dropped weapons, made desperate decisions. The organized retreat became rout. Psychological collapse became military disaster. The aftermath of Adwa sent shockwaves through European colonial world. An African nation had decisively defeated European power, using European weapons, through superior tactics, with better intelligence. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The psychological impact on colonial psychology was profound. If Ethiopians could win, couldn't other African peoples? If European technological superiority wasn't decisive, what justified continued colonial expansion? If African leaders could outthink European commanders, what happened to assumptions about European intellectual superiority? These questions haunted colonial administrators across Africa. Created doubt, created fear, created reluctance to escalate conflicts that might produce another Adwa. Menelik exploited this psychological victory for decades. Other European powers treated Ethiopia with respect earned through military success. Ethiopia remained independent while almost every other African nation fell to colonial control. The lesson Menelik teaches is about intelligence warfare, about understanding that knowledge is power, that knowing enemies' plans creates massive advantage, that creating uncertainty in enemy's mind is as effective as defeating enemy's body, that sophisticated intelligence operations can level playing field against technologically superior opponent. He also teaches about using enemies' assumptions against them, about appearing weaker than you are, about letting enemy underestimate you until moment of engagement, about turning cultural stereotypes into tactical weapons. Modern intelligence agencies study Menelik's methods, how he built networks, how he planted misinformation, how he exploited enemies' intelligence failures, how he turned information asymmetry into military advantage. These methods remain relevant because information warfare's fundamental principles remain constant even as technology changes. While Menelik was demonstrating the power of intelligence warfare, another African leader was perfecting perhaps the ultimate form of psychological warfare: religious prophecy as military weapon. Muhammad Ahmad declared himself the Mahdi, the prophesied redeemer of Islam, and used this religious authority to create military force that destroyed British and Egyptian armies through sheer psychological conviction. The Mahdi understood something profound about human psychology. People who believe they're fighting for divine purpose will endure what others won't, will sacrifice what others can't, will continue when rational calculation says stop. Religious fervor creates psychological state that makes ordinary military disadvantages irrelevant. In 1881, Muhammad Ahmad declared himself the Mahdi. This wasn't just political claim. It was psychological warfare. In Islamic tradition, the Mahdi appears at end times, defeats forces of corruption, establishes justice. His appearance signals cosmic transformation. By claiming this identity, Muhammad Ahmad wasn't just starting political movement. He was invoking entire cosmological framework, telling followers they were participants in prophesied events, that history itself was moving toward predetermined conclusion, that their victory was divinely ordained. This belief is psychologically powerful beyond measure. When you believe you're fulfilling prophecy, defeat becomes impossible psychologically. Setbacks become tests. Casualties become martyrdom. Surrender becomes spiritual failure worse than death. The Mahdi's followers, called Ansar, fought with intensity that British and Egyptian forces couldn't match. They would charge into machine gun fire without hesitation, would continue fighting when wounded, would attack fortified positions that rational military calculation said were impregnable. British commanders couldn't understand this behavior. It violated their assumptions about human nature. Surely when facing overwhelming firepower, rational people retreat. Surely when casualties mount beyond acceptable levels, forces break. Surely when defeat is obvious, surrender becomes reasonable. But the Ansar weren't operating by rational military calculation. They were operating by religious conviction. Fighting for paradise. For divine approval. For cosmic purpose. Death in battle wasn't loss, it was victory. Martyrdom wasn't failure, it was success. This psychological state creates military advantage that technology can't easily overcome. You can kill believers, but you can't make them afraid. Can't make them question. Can't break their will. They'll fight until death. And replacement believers will step forward because the cause transcends individual survival. The Mahdi also understood the power of religious ritual in warfare. Before battles, Ansar forces would pray, would recite Quranic verses, would perform spiritual preparations that created psychological state of fearlessness. These weren't just personal practices, they were public performances. British and Egyptian scouts observed them, reported seeing thousands of men praying before battle. Seeing religious leaders blessing fighters. Seeing entire army enacting ritual that demonstrated absolute conviction. This observation created psychological effect in enemy troops. When you see enemy performing religious rituals before battle, it sends message. These people believe they're protected by God. They believe they'll win or die as martyrs. They have no fear. This creates doubt in opposing troops. How do you fight people who don't fear death? How do you break will of people who believe divine power protects them? How do you intimidate people who believe dying for their cause is victory? The Mahdi also used prophecy tactically. He would make predictions about battles, about signs that would appear, about divine interventions. These predictions created psychological framework that shaped how followers interpreted events. When predictions seemed to come true, through coincidence, through careful arrangement, through selective interpretation, it reinforced belief, proved the Mahdi was genuine, strengthened conviction that they were fighting for prophesied cause. This belief made Ansar forces psychologically resilient beyond normal human limits. They could endure hardships that would break ordinary soldiers, could maintain cohesion under conditions that would fragment regular armies, could continue fighting when conventional morale would collapse. In 1883, the Mahdi's forces faced British-led Egyptian army under William Hicks. The Ansar were outnumbered and outgunned. British commanders expected straightforward victory. Instead, Ansar forces destroyed the entire army, killed Hicks, captured all weapons and supplies, left only few survivors to spread terror. The psychological impact of this victory was devastating. British-led army, modern weapons, professional officers, disciplined troops, completely destroyed by force British had dismissed as fanatic rabble. This shouldn't have been possible. Yet it happened. News of the defeat spread through British colonial establishment, created fear, created reluctance to engage Mahdiist forces, created psychological advantage that Mahdi exploited for years. British soldiers who later fought Ansar forces carried this psychological baggage, knew about Hicks's defeat, knew these enemies had destroyed professional army. This knowledge created fear before combat began, made Ansar seem more dangerous than perhaps they were. The Mahdi also understood the power of symbols in psychological warfare. He dressed distinctively, created specific flag for his movement, established visual markers that made Ansar forces immediately identifiable. These symbols became psychologically loaded. Seeing the Mahdi's flag triggered fear in enemies and courage in followers. This symbolic warfare operates at unconscious level. Symbols bypass rational thought, trigger emotional responses. The Mahdi symbols became associated with Ansar victories, with religious fervor, with unstoppable assault. Seeing them created immediate psychological impact. The Mahdi's greatest psychological victory was the siege and capture of Khartoum in 1885. British General Charles Gordon defended the city for nearly a year. Gordon was famous, experienced, believed nearly invincible. His presence in Khartoum was supposed to make it psychologically impregnable. But the Mahdi laid siege, cut off supplies, applied psychological pressure through isolation and constant threat. Gordon's troops gradually lost hope. Supplies dwindled. Relief force that British government promised never arrived. Psychological isolation became as devastating as physical isolation. When Ansar forces finally breached Khartoum's defenses, Gordon was killed. His death sent shockwaves through British Empire. If Gordon could be defeated, who was safe? If Khartoum could fall, what city was secure? If the Mahdi could kill Britain's most famous general, what couldn't he do? This psychological victory mattered more than territorial gain. It shattered British invincibility myth, proved that even famous commanders, even defended cities, even imperial prestige couldn't guarantee victory against forces motivated by religious conviction. The Mahdi died shortly after capturing Khartoum, but his movement continued for years. His successor maintained the psychological framework he'd created, continued exploiting religious conviction as military weapon. British eventually reconquered Sudan, but only through massive military commitment that cost enormously in resources and lives. The lesson the Mahdi teaches is about belief as supreme psychological weapon. About understanding that people who believe they're fighting for cosmic purpose operate by different psychological rules than people fighting for political goals. About recognizing that religious conviction can overcome material disadvantage through sheer psychological intensity. He also teaches about the power of prophecy and symbolism. About creating narrative frameworks that make followers interpret events as confirming their beliefs. About using ritual and symbol to create psychological states that enhance military effectiveness. Modern militaries and intelligence agencies study religious extremism partly because it operates by psychological principles the Mahdi exploited. How do you fight enemy that doesn't fear death? How do you break will of forces that believe defeat is impossible? How do you counter narratives that frame every outcome as divine plan? These questions have no easy answers, because the psychological power of religious conviction remains as potent today as in 1880 Sudan. Technology advances, tactics evolve, but human capacity for belief, for sacrifice, for fighting beyond rational limits when motivated by religious conviction, this remains constant. Both Menelik and the Mahdi demonstrated that psychological warfare could take radically different forms. Intelligence and sophistication versus religious fervor and prophecy. Careful planning versus divine conviction. Rational strategy versus transcendent belief. Yet both achieved the same result, defeating colonial forces that should have been superior. Proving that indigenous psychological warfare, properly executed, could match or exceed colonial military power. Showing that the mind, properly mobilized, properly weaponized, properly directed, was ultimate battlefield. These 7 warriors, Nzinga, Samori, Santawa, Setshweo, Bihanzin, Menelik, and the Mahdi, each approached psychological warfare differently. Each adapted to their specific context. Each brilliantly effective in their own way. Each proving that colonial conquest was never inevitable. That indigenous knowledge, creativity, and psychological understanding could challenge even overwhelming material advantage. Their victories weren't just military achievements. They were proofs of concept. demonstrations that the colonized could defeat colonizers, that African military intelligence matched or exceeded European, that psychological warfare could be more decisive than technology, that indigenous practices, ritual, prophecy, cultural knowledge, could be weaponized effectively against colonial powers. But to fully understand their legacy, we must examine what these victories meant, what they proved, what they teach us today, what they reveal about warfare, psychology, and human potential. These 7 warriors defeated colonial armies not through superior weapons but through superior understanding of human psychology. They proved that warfare is ultimately about will, not material, about mind, not just body, about belief, not just capability. Their victories reveal fundamental truths about power, resistance, and human potential that remain relevant today. The first truth these warriors demonstrated is that technological advantage is psychological, not absolute. European colonial powers justified their expansion through narratives of technological superiority. They had guns, armor, organization. They believed these advantages made victory inevitable. But technology is only as effective as the psychology of those wielding it. Soldiers who hesitate don't shoot effectively. Commanders who doubt their intelligence make poor decisions. Troops who question their mission fight without full commitment. When psychological factors undermine technological capability, the advantage disappears. Nzinga understood this when she made Portuguese soldiers believe they were fighting supernatural forces. The Portuguese rifle still worked. Their armor still protected. Their training still mattered. But when soldiers believe they're facing spirits, when commanders can't predict enemy movements, when the entire worldview justifying the war becomes uncertain, technology alone can't guarantee victory. Samori demonstrated this through 17 years of mobile warfare. French forces had superior weapons throughout the conflict. But their psychological state, constant uncertainty, perpetual exhaustion, never knowing where Samori would appear next, negated their material advantages. Technology requires stable psychology to be effectively deployed. Destabilized psychology and technology becomes less relevant. The second truth is that culture is not weakness but potential weapon. Colonial narratives portrayed African cultures as primitive, as obstacles to be overcome, as evidence of backwardness that justified European intervention. These warriors inverted this narrative. They weaponized their cultures, turned spiritual practices into tactical advantages, used cultural knowledge of terrain, of psychology, of human nature to create military effectiveness that exceeded European capabilities. Yarasantawa mobilized Ashanti spiritual beliefs to create warriors who fought with intensity British forces couldn't match. The cultural framework that Europeans dismissed as superstition proved to be a sophisticated psychological tool for creating specific mental states that enhanced combat effectiveness. Sechweo used Zulu cultural practices, coordinated movement, war chants, spiritual preparation, to create psychological assault that broke British cohesion before physical combat began. Culture was an obstacle to military effectiveness. It was foundation of military effectiveness. This principle extends beyond warfare. Any system that dismisses cultural practices as primitive misses their potential utility. Every culture evolves practices that solve specific problems. Dismissing these practices because they don't fit external frameworks is strategic error. The warriors proved this through victory after victory against forces that underestimated cultural knowledge. The third truth is that belief shapes reality on the battlefield more than in almost any other human endeavor. In most situations, material facts constrain what belief can achieve. You can believe you can fly, but gravity still operates. You can believe you're wealthy, but bank account doesn't change. But in warfare, belief changes everything. Soldiers who believe they'll win fight differently than soldiers who expect defeat. Warriors who believe they're protected by divine forces take risks that others won't. Forces that believe their cause is just endure hardships that others can't. The Mahdi proved this definitively. His forces fought British and Egyptian armies that were materially superior in every measurable way. But Mahdiist belief in prophesied victory, in divine protection, in martyrdom as success. This belief created psychological state that made material disadvantages irrelevant. Ansar warriors charging machine guns weren't being irrational. They were operating by different rationality. One where spiritual success mattered more than physical survival. Where dying for the cause was victory, not defeat. Where belief literally transformed the meaning of every battlefield event. This reveals something profound about human psychology. We can choose what framework gives meaning to our experiences. And that choice determines our behavior more than material circumstances. The warriors understood this. Used it. Created belief frameworks that made their forces psychologically superior despite material inferiority. The fourth truth is that perception is tactical weapon. How enemy perceives you matters as much as your actual capabilities. If enemy overestimates you, they fight cautiously. Waste resources. Make conservative decisions. If enemy underestimates you, they're psychologically unprepared when you demonstrate actual capability. Behanzon's female warriors exploited this through gender. French forces underestimated female warriors because cultural assumptions said women couldn't be effective combatants. This underestimation created tactical opportunities. Allowed female warriors to achieve objectives male warriors couldn't have because enemy wasn't psychologically prepared. Menelik exploited this through seeming diplomatic sophistication. Presented himself as negotiator while building military capability. Italians perceived diplomatic Menelik and military Menelik as separate entities. This perceptual failure created intelligence gaps that Menelik exploited at Adwa. The lesson is that managing enemy perception is a form of warfare. You're not just fighting enemy forces. You're fighting enemy's mental model of you. If you can control that model, make them see what you want them to see, believe what you want them to believe, you gain advantage before physical combat begins. The fifth truth is that indigenous knowledge is sophisticated, not primitive. Colonial narratives portrayed European knowledge as advanced and African knowledge as backwards. These warriors shattered that narrative through demonstrating that indigenous knowledge of terrain, psychology, culture, and warfare could exceed European military science. Samori's knowledge of West African terrain let him create mobility that French forces couldn't match. This wasn't luck. This was detailed knowledge acquired over lifetime. Knowledge of every valley, every water source, every path. Knowledge that European maps couldn't capture and European scouts couldn't quickly acquire. Nzinga's understanding of Portuguese psychology, their assumptions, fears, cultural frameworks, allowed her to manipulate them with precision. This wasn't instinct. This was sophisticated psychological analysis that would impress modern intelligence agencies. The warriors proved that indigenous knowledge systems are different from European knowledge, not inferior to it. They solve different problems, emphasize different capabilities. When applied to warfare, they can create advantages that European military science doesn't address. This has implications beyond military history. Any system that dismisses indigenous knowledge as primitive likely misses sophisticated solutions to complex problems. The warriors teach us to recognize that knowledge takes many forms. That different forms serve different purposes. That sophistication isn't defined by resemblance to European frameworks. The sixth truth is that resistance is always possible. Colonial expansion created narrative of inevitability. That European power would triumph. That African resistance was futile. That technological and organizational superiority made colonial victory predetermined. These warriors proved that narrative false. They demonstrated that resistance could succeed, that colonial forces could be defeated, that indigenous peoples weren't helpless before European expansion, that victory was possible even against overwhelming odds. This wasn't just military lesson. It was psychological warfare operating at civilizational level. Every colonial victory reinforced narrative of inevitability. Every indigenous defeat seemed to prove European superiority. This narrative paralyzed resistance, made fighting seem pointless, made submission seem rational. The warriors broke this narrative. Their victories proved resistance wasn't futile, proved colonial expansion wasn't inevitable, proved that European forces could be defeated by African forces using African methods enhanced by psychological sophistication. This psychological impact extended far beyond their immediate conflicts. News of their victories spread across Africa, inspired other resistance movements, created psychological foundation for anti-colonial struggles that continued for generations, proved that the supposedly inevitable could be resisted, challenged, sometimes defeated. The seventh truth is that psychological warfare is universal human capability, not cultural specific. European powers believed they had monopoly on sophisticated military strategy, believed that psychological warfare, propaganda, information operations were products of European civilization. These warriors proved otherwise, demonstrated that psychological warfare exists in every culture, that African military traditions understood psychological dimensions of combat as deeply as European traditions, that sophisticated psychological manipulation isn't culturally specific but universally human. This matters because it challenges cultural hierarchies that persist today. The assumption that certain capabilities belong exclusively to certain cultures. That psychological sophistication, strategic thinking, complex planning are markers of advanced civilizations. The warriors show that these capabilities are human universals, present in all cultures, just expressed differently, taking forms shaped by specific cultural contexts but existing universally. African psychological warfare looked different from European psychological warfare, but it was equally sophisticated, equally effective, sometimes superior. These 7 warriors lived centuries ago. Their conflicts ended long before anyone reading this was born. Yet their lessons remain profoundly relevant. Because human psychology hasn't changed. Because the dynamics of asymmetric conflict persist. Because power is still ultimately about will, belief, and perception more than material capability. Modern military forces study these conflicts precisely because psychological principles the warriors exploited remain operational. How do you maintain morale under extreme psychological pressure? How do you prevent enemy propaganda from degrading your forces' will to fight? How do you conduct operations when enemy controls information space? How do you fight forces motivated by religious conviction that makes normal psychological pressures irrelevant? These questions don't have easy answers. Because the human mind's vulnerabilities that colonial forces experienced haven't been solved. Technology changes. Weapons improve. But soldiers still experience fear. Still doubt their missions. Still break under sufficient psychological pressure. Still make mistakes when exhausted, uncertain, or fighting unclear cause. The warrior's methods translate to modern contexts. Nzinga's use of ritual and mythology becomes modern propaganda and psychological operations. Samori's information warfare becomes modern intelligence operations. Santowa's mobilization of spiritual conviction becomes modern ideological warfare. Sechueo's coordinated psychological assault becomes modern combined arms operations with psychological dimensions. Behanzon's exploitation of cultural assumptions becomes modern asymmetric warfare. Menelik's intelligence superiority becomes modern SIGINT and human intelligence operations. The Mahdi's religious mobilization becomes modern extremist recruitment and motivation. Every modern conflict contains echoes of what these warriors pioneered, not because modern militaries consciously adopted their methods, but because they independently discovered psychological principles that are universal, that work regardless of time period, that exploit human nature in ways that remain constant despite technological change. The warriors also teach lessons about resistance relevant beyond military contexts, about how the apparently powerless can challenge the powerful, about how asymmetric conflicts can be won by leveraging psychological advantages against material disadvantages, about how belief, perception, and will can overcome numerical and technological inferiority. These lessons apply to social movements, to political struggles, to any context where one side has material power and the other doesn't. The warriors demonstrate that material power isn't absolute, that it depends on psychological factors that can be manipulated, that narrative, belief, and perception can shift power dynamics in ways that material analysis would miss. They also teach about the danger of underestimating opponents. Every colonial force that fought these warriors underestimated them, believed African forces couldn't match European military capability, believed technological superiority guaranteed victory, believed cultural assumptions about African primitiveness. These underestimations cost them, created vulnerabilities, allowed warriors to exploit gaps in colonial understanding, made colonial forces psychologically unprepared for the actual capabilities they faced. This lesson remains relevant for any power dynamic. The powerful tend to underestimate the weak, tend to believe their advantages are larger than they are, tend to miss capabilities that don't fit their assumptions. This creates opportunities for those they underestimate, creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited. The warriors demonstrated that being underestimated is tactical advantage. It creates surprise, creates gaps in enemy preparation, creates opportunities to demonstrate capabilities enemy didn't expect. Smart resistance movements recognize this. Don't demand to be taken seriously. Instead, exploit not being taken seriously until moment when surprise matters most. If there's one lesson that unifies all 7 warriors, it's this: the mind is the ultimate battlefield. Control the mind, yours, your followers, your enemies, and material circumstances become less determinative. Fail to control the mind and material advantages become irrelevant. This isn't mystical claim. It's observable fact. Throughout military history, forces with material advantages have lost to forces with psychological advantages. Motivated soldiers defeat better equipped unmotivated soldiers. Cohesive forces defeat larger fragmenting forces. Warriors who believe in their cause outlast mercenaries fighting for pay. These warriors understood this intuitively, built their entire strategies around it, recognized that making enemy afraid, uncertain, divided, or doubtful was more effective than trying to kill every enemy soldier. That breaking enemies' will to fight was more decisive than breaking enemies' body. They achieved this through different methods, but all methods shared common foundation: deep understanding of human psychology. Understanding that humans have predictable responses to uncertainty, to fear, to cognitive dissonance, to challenges to their worldview. Understanding that these responses can be triggered, manipulated, exploited. Colonial forces had technological advantages, but they were psychologically vulnerable. The warriors found those vulnerabilities, exploited them brilliantly, turned them into strategic weaknesses that negated material strengths. This is why their victories matter. not just as historical events, but as proof of concept, as demonstrations that psychological warfare, properly executed, can overcome massive material disadvantages, as evidence that indigenous knowledge, cultural practices, and deep understanding of human nature create military capabilities that technology alone can't counter. Their legacy continues in every resistance movement that defeats supposedly superior opponent. In every asymmetric conflict where belief and will triumph over weapons and numbers. In every situation where understanding human psychology matters more than having best equipment. They teach us that power isn't just about what you have. It's about what others believe you have. What they believe about themselves. What narratives shape their understanding of conflict. What psychological states they carry into battle. Control these factors and you control outcomes. Fail to control them and material advantages become temporary, fragile, ultimately insufficient. The seven warriors proved this through decades of resistance. Through victories that should have been impossible. Through demonstrating that indigenous psychological warfare could match or exceed colonial military power. Through showing that the human mind, properly weaponized, is more powerful than any physical weapon. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not just as history, but as lessons, as examples, as proof that resistance is possible. That psychological sophistication exists in all cultures. That indigenous knowledge can challenge colonial power. That the supposedly inevitable can be fought, resisted, sometimes defeated. They were more than warriors. They were psychologists, strategists, masters of human nature, manipulators of belief and perception. They understood something that modern military academies still teach, that warfare is ultimately about breaking enemies' will to fight, about creating psychological conditions where retreat becomes more attractive than persistence, about winning the battle in the mind before winning it on the ground. This is Folklore Crypt. And remember, power is ultimately psychological. The powerful maintain power partly through belief that their power is inevitable. The powerless gain power by shattering that belief, by demonstrating that resistance is possible, by proving that will, belief, and psychological sophistication can overcome material disadvantage. These seven warriors did this, each in their own way. Each proving that indigenous knowledge is sophisticated, that African military traditions understood psychological warfare deeply, that colonial conquest was never inevitable, that resistance could succeed. Their victories were temporary. Eventually, overwhelming colonial resources prevailed, but their psychological victories lasted longer, inspired generations, proved that European power wasn't absolute, that African peoples could fight, could win, could demonstrate military capability equal to any in the world. That legacy matters, not just for African military history, but for understanding resistance itself, for recognizing that asymmetric conflicts aren't always determined by material factors. That psychological dimensions of warfare can overcome technological advantages. That human will, properly mobilized, is ultimate weapon. Before the fire went out, that's when the best stories were told. And now the fire is out. The stories are told. The lessons are given. May you understand that power isn't just material. That resistance is always possible. That psychological sophistication exists in every culture. That the mind is ultimate battlefield. That belief shapes reality in war more than in any other human endeavor. May you remember these seven warriors, their victories, their methods, their proof that indigenous knowledge could defeat colonial power. That African military genius could match any in world. That psychological warfare is universal human capability, not cultural specific. May their legacy inspire understanding that warfare is ultimately about will, about psychology, About who can maintain determination longest. About who can make enemy lose faith first. About using belief, perception and cultural knowledge as weapons more powerful than any technology. This is Folklore Crypt.